All right. Good morning, everybody. So, we are talking this week. Our theme is progressivism and the Great War. So, we are going to be looking at kind of two topics today, but they are related. The progressive movement is a sort of reform movement that began in the late 19th century and went up into the early part of the 20th century. And then out of that movement comes to a large degree America's involvement in what was then known as the Great War, what we know today as the First World War or World War One. So that is what we're going to be talking about in my video lecture this week. So, we're going to start off by talking about what was the Progressive Era. Why do we call this period in American history the Progressive Era? Who were the Progressives? What were some of the reforms they pushed? We're going to look at the question of, is this label progressive really an appropriate one? Was this really a progressive era? And if so, how progressive was it? So, the progressive era, in many ways, really marks the beginning of the transition to modern American society as we know it. Beginning in the 1890s and lasting up to around 1920 or the end of World War I, American society experienced an unprecedented wave of reforming spirit. This era is known to historians as the Progressive Era, and the social reforms that occurred during this era are known as the Progressive Movement. But to some extent, this is a convenient label that's been placed on reforms that were not comprehensive, not unified, often very contradictory. Progressive reformers were a varied lot of individuals. They shared some characteristics, but they differed widely in their approaches and their views. Not all progressives agreed with each other, and this wasn't a unified or coherent movement. But in general, this period in American history is characterized by a recognition of the problems that were plaguing American society and a willingness to both expose those problems and to try to remedy them. So we have the muckrakers, journalists, both men and women, who sought to expose corruption and social problems in national magazines, which were an early form of mass media. We have efforts to reform government at the local, state, and national level, both by putting government in the hands of the experts and also by expanding democracy and giving more power to the people through reforms like the initiative, the referendum, the recall, the passage of the 17th Amendment, which led to the direct election of U.S. senators, and the 19th Amendment, extending the right to vote to women. We have three successive presidents: Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson, Republicans and Democrats, who all called themselves progressives and who worked to pass reforms, breaking up monopolies, pushing for a larger regulatory role for the federal government, setting aside public lands for conservation. We have a lot of labor union activists pushing to improve working conditions and outlawing child labor. We have women like Margaret Sanger who pressed for access to birth control, leading to the creation of what would eventually become known as Planned Parenthood. We also, during the Progressive Era, have crusades against vice with the passage of legislation like the Comstock Act of 1873, prohibiting the distribution of obscene, lewd, or lascivious, immoral, or indecent publications through the mail, and which was later applied to information about birth control and abortion. We have the Mann Act in 1910, which was aimed at combating what we today would call sex trafficking, and the long sought culmination of the temperance movement with the passage of the 18th Amendment in 1920, outlawing the distribution and sale of alcohol and instituting prohibition. And many people who considered themselves to be progressives, including people like Margaret Sanger, believed firmly in the pseudoscience of eugenics, the idea that you could improve society as a whole by encouraging fitter people to have more children and discouraging, sometimes through forced sterilization, the unfit from having children. Progressivism was definitely a middle class movement and sometimes reflected values that many Americans today would consider to be pretty conservative. Many progressives tended to be pretty well convinced that their way was the best way, and everyone, especially people from lower social classes, should adopt their middle class, white, Anglo Saxon Protestant worldviews and lifestyle. So the question of is this label progressive an appropriate one uh, is something that you'll really have to think about this week. Recent scholarship on the history of the progressive era have sort of tried to look for new historical actors beyond the traditional focus on largely white, often male reformers, government officials, industrialists. Uh, and we're starting to see kind of more emphasis on looking at gender, on different racial groups during the progressive era, on environmental studies, to look at sort of new ways that we understand the development of identity and culture during this period. And historians are beginning to highlight the involvement of previously overlooked historical actors who shaped this period of social change and who might not always have been helped by its reforms. For example, many of the policies of this era, rather than improving conditions for everybody, ended up marginalizing certain groups of people and were very crucial to the development of modern inequalities. So, for example, historians have begun to look at the role that disability played in examining how the US government came to exclude certain people based on disability as part of this broader project of immigration restriction that happens during the so called progressive era. Sexuality also gets regulated during this era, and particularly, sort of looking at gay and lesbian people, and sort of their experience during the progressive era. And there have even been, sort of efforts to look at, sort of how progressives thought about the issue of race and eugenics, and sort of looking at kind of the racial divides that plagued America during the progressive era. So the question of how progressive the progressive era really was is one I think that we should, sort of definitely consider. So, progressivism was, if anything, a very contradictory movement. Invariably, if some progressives believed they could improve society in one way, another group believed that they could improve society by doing the exact opposite thing. So, what were some of the general characteristics defining progressivism? Progressives were concerned about the effects of industrialization and the conditions of urban industrial life. They were looking to help ameliorate some of those negative aspects of industrialization that we've already talked about. They wanted to use government to be able to reform society, so they turned more and more to the authority of the state and the government at all levels. And they had a real faith in the benefits of science and human expertise. They were confident they could understand and control society and the environment in which people were living. And there was really no single issue or concern that united all progressives, but in general, they believed that a better world was possible. Progress depended upon knowledge, and they really stressed using science and expertise to kind of improve society. One of the first tasks of progressives was to expose the social ills that they felt needed to be remedied. So, in the first few years of the 20th century, a variety of American journalists, novelists, writers, critics set out to do just that. And they were given this label muckrakers by Teddy Roosevelt in 1906. Roosevelt was a little bit critical of the muckrakers. He thought sometimes they were just digging up dirt for the sake of digging up dirt, and that they were ignoring some of the good things going on in society. But he definitely strongly supported muckraking when it was necessary. Muckrakers tackled a number of social issues, including, but not limited to, questionable stock market practices, racial violence, the treatment of the mentally ill, patent medicines, chronic unemployment, child labor, the unsanitary conditions in industry, the urban poverty problem, corruption in big businesses. Muckraking was very popular and successful during this period because it really benefited from a new phenomenon in the history of American media. There was this magazine revolution going on in the late 19th century. So, magazines, national magazines, were coming on the scene during this period. And in order to, instead of depending on individual subscribers to cover the costs of production, magazines began to be financed by advertising, and that could be aimed at a mass audience. So, one of the leading muckraking journals, this example of McClure's magazine, was run by a man named Samuel McClure. He realized he could almost give away his magazine for free and still make a profit just from the advertising. So, he begins publishing McClure's magazine in 1893 at a very low cost of 15 cents a copy. And so muckraking appeared just when magazines started to enter into the average American home. And muckrakers really endorsed and tried to appeal to traditional American values. So they really sought to reach a mass audience. Improving working conditions was a big part of the progressive movement. As we've seen, there were dangerous, deadly conditions in many factories and workplaces throughout the country. As machines and assembly lines and production sped up, disaster became increasingly likely. And the terrible danger of working conditions was really brought home to the whole nation in 1911 when there was a fire at a shirt making company in New York City, the Triangle Shirtwaist Company. The company occupied the top 3 floors of a 10-story building, and it employed around 500 workers, mostly young immigrant women from places like Italy and Eastern Europe. Some of these women were not really women at all. They were girls. They were 12 or 13 years old. And they worked these very long 14-hour shifts during a 60 or 72-hour work week. They were making clothing for a wage of about $1.50 a week. The conditions of the factory were very typical of the time. There were flammable textiles all throughout the factory, scraps of fabric all over the floors, patterns and designs hanging on sheets of tissue paper above the tables. Smoking was very common. The illumination was provided by open gas lighting, and there were no fire extinguishers. So, in the afternoon of March 25th, 1911, a fire broke out on the 8th floor. We don't know what caused the fire, whether it was accidental or intentional. It's thought that it's probably either a lighted match or a cigarette. Workers on the 10th and 8th floors were alerted to the fire, and most people on those 2 floors were able to evacuate in time. But the warning about the fire did not get to the 9th floor in time. The 9th floor had only 2 doors leading out. One of the stairwells was already filling up with smoke and flames by the time the seamstresses realized the building was ablaze. The other door had been locked, and this was to prevent workers from either stealing materials or taking breaks, and also to keep out union organizers. The workers at the company had taken part just a couple of years prior in this large general strike among the garment industry in New York. And they had tried to unionize, and unfortunately, their owners of the company had prevented them from unionizing, and they had, sort of not been able to, sort of get a union in the company. So the owners were very, wary of any kind of union activity. The single exterior fire escape on the building, which was this very flimsy structure, pretty quickly collapsed under the weight of the people trying to escape. And the elevator also stopped working, so that cut off that means of escape, partly because workers in panic tried to save themselves by jumping down the shaft to land on the roof of the elevator. Realizing that there was no other way to escape being burned to death, some of the women broke the windows and jumped to the ground 9 floors below. And the fallen bodies and falling victims made it very difficult for the fire department to reach the building. The fire department arrived, but was unable to stop the flames because actually there were no ladders that were tall enough to reach beyond the sixth floor. The final death toll of the fire was 146 people, mostly these young women and girls. The American public was shocked at this incident and they demanded reform. The International Ladies Garment Workers Union, working with local government officials, they pushed for passing some really comprehensive safety and workers' compensation laws at the state level. So we don't start to see these kinds of laws being passed on the federal level yet, but we are starting to see, especially because of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, a real effort to try to improve working conditions in factories around the country. There's also efforts to try to combat child labor, was a major cause for some progressives. In 1880, over 1 million children were documented as part of the paid workforce. And that number was actually much, much larger, since about a half of the children in the country were living on farms where their labor was unpaid and just kind of expected as being part of a farming family. By 1900, that number had gone down to 284,000. And this was largely due to progressive reformers who sought to restrict the employment of school-aged children. The result of this was a dramatic increase in education and literacy. More children than ever before began attending public school, and the number of public high schools also increased from about 100 in 1880 to by 1900, there were more than 6,000. Progressive era reforms sought to restrict the employment of school-aged children, and it led to successfully passing laws limiting child labor in at least a dozen states. These laws were not always enforced, but they really helped to reduce the number of children who were being either killed or injured in industrial accidents. The National Consumers League was the advocacy group that sought to end child labor and other abusive working practices by exposing and informing consumers about the working conditions under which some of the products that were being produced were being made. Florence Kelly was the leader of this group, and she traveled around the country documenting the conditions of working women and children. The National Child Labor Committee was organized in 1904 to push for legislation and to try to lobby Congress to outlaw child labor. We don't see real sort of efforts at the federal level for legislation outlawing child labor until the Great Depression, when Congress agreed to pass these laws in order to protect jobs for adult men. But in 1912, President Taft did establish a Children's Bureau within the Department of Labor, and they pushed for measures to protect children in the workplace as well. Another big famous reform effort of the Progressive era was the passage of legislation designed to protect public health, and specifically to regulate the nation's food supply. This reform effort arose directly out of a novel published by a man named Upton Sinclair, The Jungle, published in 1906. If you've ever read The Jungle, you'll know that it's actually not so much about the disgusting conditions in the meatpacking industry. Sinclair really intended his book to be an expose of the lives of working class Americans. But Americans who read the book largely ignored this part of his argument entirely and focused mainly on his descriptions of these disgusting conditions in the slaughterhouses. It was so sort of shocking to people, and that foreign sales of American meat fell by a half. And in order to calm public outrage and demonstrate the cleanliness of their meat, major meat packers lobbied the federal government to pass legislation paying for additional inspection and certification of meat packaged in the United States. Upton Sinclair once sort of lamented about his book. He said, "He aimed at the public's heart, and by accident I hit it in the stomach." One of the people who read The Jungle was President Theodore Roosevelt, and after reading it, he ordered an investigation. And it was through sort of the cooperation of Roosevelt and Sinclair and the meatpacking industry that in 1906 they passed the Meat Inspection Act, setting rules for sanitary meatpacking and requiring government inspection of meat products. A second sort of measure along this line, the Pure Food and Drug Act, was helped along by another muckraking author, a man named Samuel Hopkins Adams. He wrote articles for a magazine about the dangers of patent medicines. He argued that these so-called miracle cures that were being advertised were mostly alcohol and other illicit drugs like opium, and they were promising all kinds of, sort of curing all kinds of diseases. Well, in fact, they were just getting people addicted to these medicines. The Pure Food and Drug Act was supported by Roosevelt and the American Medical Association, and it required manufacturers to list certain label ingredients on the label, and it banned the manufacture and sale of unsanitary food or drugs. Both of these efforts actually led to the creation of the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. Some progressives were also appalled at what they saw as the moral degeneration of society. This resulted in a crusade against vice and for so-called purity. One of the major targets of the Purity Crusaders was alcoholism and the saloon. The leader of the anti-alcohol crusade was the Women's Christian Temperance Union. The WCTU had nearly 250,000 members by 1911, which made it the largest organization of women in American history up to that point. And they joined together with other groups to press for the abolition of alcohol consumption and the destruction of the saloon industry. By 1916, 19 states had gone dry. They had passed laws prohibiting alcohol. Eventually, they took their campaign to the national level and succeeded in passing the 18th Amendment prohibiting alcohol, which took effect in January of 1920. And at the time, progressives really thought that prohibition would be a major step toward eliminating social instability and moral wrong. As we're going to see next week, this didn't end up happening, but it was this sort of noble experiment that they tried to put in place. Progressive reformers also worked to get rid of prostitution. They were successful in banning brothels in almost every state by 1915. In 1910, they passed the Mann Act, which prohibited the interstate transportation of women for quote-unquote immoral purposes. And so this really reflected the desire of progressives to elevate American society and their willingness to use the government to do that. At the same time that some progressives were concerned with regulating society's morals, others were working to expand the moral and the healthcare options available to men and women. And one of the most famous of these was Margaret Sanger. At the beginning of the 20th century, birth control was a very controversial issue. Religious Americans, both Catholic and Protestant, opposed birth control vehemently. Others argued that it would foster promiscuity. The Comstock Act of 1873 had been passed banning the distribution of birth control information. By 1914, 22 states had enacted laws restricting the distribution of information on birth control. Margaret Sanger was sort of a crusader against this. She sought to actually promote the idea of birth control. She was a young wife and mother in New York City in the early 20th century, and she wasn't particularly happy in her marriage. She ended up sort of spending a lot of time in Greenwich Village, which was a hotbed of kind of radical ideas during this time. She became a labor activist and worked to organize women and marched in labor picket lines. She also pursued a nursing career, and she began to work in neighborhoods on the Lower East Side in New York. This is largely tenement housing. And she was very surprised at how these women living in these neighborhoods didn't know really anything about their own health, their own bodies, their own reproductive health. And so in 1912, she wrote a series of newspaper articles about STDs and personal hygiene entitled What Every Girl Should Know. These got her banned from using the mail. And she was seeing all of these poor working class women being burdened by unwanted pregnancies and occasionally dying from either self-induced or back alley abortions. She resolved to, she said, seek out the root of the evil, to do something to change the destinies of mothers. She coined the term birth control in 1914, and she set out to promote understanding and practice of birth control methods. She spent about a year learning about contraceptives and began publishing a journal that she called Women Rebel. This was really aimed at working class women, and this ran for only about 7 issues before it was banned by the post office. She was indicted under the Comstock Act, and she actually had to flee to Europe for a while. When she came back to the United States, she again defied the law in 1916 by opening the nation's first birth control clinic in Brooklyn, New York. The police raided her clinic. She was arrested. She was sentenced to 30 days in jail. In 1921, she organized the American Birth Control League. She held clinics and conferences to try to educate the public. And so by the 1940s, every state, with the exception of Massachusetts and Connecticut, had legalized the distribution of birth control information. In recent years, Sanger has been seen as rather a controversial figure, not so much for her belief in birth control and family planning, but for her belief in eugenics. Like many progressives, Sanger bought into the idea of eugenics as a quote-unquote scientific way to improve society. And a lot of opponents of Planned Parenthood today have criticized her view on eugenics in an attempt to discredit this movement that she founded. Planned Parenthood itself has denounced Sanger's eugenicist beliefs. And so, sort of by the standards of today, I think we can certainly criticize her for her eugenic beliefs and sort of her approach to dealing with the kind of immigrant and communities of color that she was trying to help. This is one of those cases, though, where we have to be really conscious of presentism and recognize that historical figures like Sanger are complicated. History is complicated. By today's standards, we would probably consider her to be racist. By the standards of her day, perhaps not so much. So we really have to kind of set aside our modern worldviews here and try to think about her and her contributions and the sort of whole person who she was. Reformers also worked to reorder government, especially at the city and state level. In the cities, progressives created urban reform leagues, which formed a professional, non-political civil service. And the goal here was really efficiency and results. They stressed the use of experts. They wanted to create sort of a city government which was staffed by these professional experts. And so they created things like regulatory commissions and municipal departments to reorganize the ways that cities were run. On the state level, progressives worked to strengthen state laws, as we've seen, regulating the labor of women and children, regulating railroads and utilities, improving institutions, mental institutions, prisons in states, allowing for more state funds for state universities, creating regulatory commissions to investigate business conduct. Another way that progressives tried to reform government was through reducing the power of politicians and in putting more power in the hands of the voters. There were 3 measures that were passed in many states in the late 19th and early 20th century designed to make elected officials more responsive to the public's will. The initiative, a way to allow voters to propose new laws. Referendums, which allowed voters to reject or accept laws that had been passed by the state legislature. And the recall, a way to remove elected officials from office. In another effort to make government more democratic, all but 3 states used direct primary elections by 1916, which allowed voters to choose who the candidates would be for office. And in 1913, the 17th Amendment was passed, which provided for the direct election of American senators. Even though a lot of the progressive reforms took place at the local and state level, the problems facing the country poverty, economic instability, problems with our democracy. These were really national problems that demanded national solutions. So during the Progressive era, we have three successive presidents, both Republican and Democrat, who attempted to address these challenges. Theodore Roosevelt served in office from 1901 to 1908. He was very famous for breaking up trusts. He pushed for more federal regulation of the economy. He was very committed to the idea of conservation, conserving America's natural resources. William Howard Taft, his successor, Taft had been Roosevelt's vice president. He was a little bit more conservative than Roosevelt was, but he also pushed for antitrust policies and supported a graduated income tax passed with the 16th Amendment. And then in the election of 1912, Roosevelt and Taft battled with each other for the Republican nomination. And when the Republicans chose Taft as their nominee, Roosevelt decided he was going to start a new progressive party, whose platform brought together many of the different competing strands of progressivism. Roosevelt and Taft ended up splitting the Republican vote, which allowed for the election of the Democratic candidate, Woodrow Wilson, who served from 1912 to 1920. Wilson also considered himself to be a progressive. He expanded the power of the federal government. He created the Federal Reserve System and the Federal Trade Commission, and there were other reforms that were passed during his administration. So the fruits of progressivism, really we see a reform of society and government at all levels. We see women playing a huge role in spearheading much of the progressive era reforms. But we've also seen that progressivism has a complicated historical legacy. Some of the quote-unquote reforms that progressives passed would probably not be considered all that progressive or desirable today. And what we're going to see is that World War I really puts an end to the optimism of the progressive era. So Woodrow Wilson comes into office. He is a progressive, and his progressivism really drove his foreign policy. Wilson's foreign policy was driven by a vision of a harmonious, prosperous international situation. He believed that the United States had a big role to play in the world and that its influence and good example could bring about peace internationally. He was an academic. He was a firm believer in democratic principles. He said that democracy is the fullest form of state life because it made politics a sphere of moral action. And he believed in domestic reform and saw there being a real connection with foreign policy. He believed the United States should be this light to the rest of the world that would guide mankind toward justice and liberty and peace. And so when war breaks out in Europe in 1914, Wilson is very much interested in sort of maintaining America's neutrality. The United States had not been directly involved in any of the controversies that began the war. And Wilson called upon Americans to be neutral in fact as well as in name. He argued that America had to be neutral in order to sort of maintain this kind of neutral power that was going to be disinterested and be able to kind of, create peace eventually. The majority of Americans, though, including President Wilson, were much more sympathetic to the British in this conflict in Europe. We had stronger bonds with the British, and we also felt sort of very strongly toward the French. Our bonds with France were not as close as they were with the British, but they were more sentimental. And once reports about what the Germans were doing in Europe, in Belgium and France, came out, all of these supposed atrocities that the Germans were committing, this ends up strengthening American hostility towards Germany. But not all Americans were on the side of the British and the French. There were large immigrant communities in the United States who reacted to the war based on their ties to their homeland. There were many German Americans during the war who sort of felt, kind of strongly connected to Germany. There were many Irish Americans who did not sort of agree with the United States allying with Britain because the Irish were, combating the British at that time. So, in personal feelings, Wilson was not really neutral at all. He was firmly anti German, but he argued that the United States needed to be neutral because the American people did not want to go to war. And if America needed to be this model and leader for the world, we needed to maintain our domestic unity. Now, neutrality did not mean that the US would just disengage from the rest of the world. We still wanted to trade. And the outbreak of war caused this immediate economic panic in the United States because international law allowed neutral nations to trade with warring powers, but it also allowed those warring powers to intercept ships and confiscate cargo. And, so the warring powers are trying to kind of restrict the rights of neutral powers so they're not going to benefit the enemy side. So in 1915, Britain institutes a naval blockade of Germany. And the Germans counter this naval blockade with the use of U-boats or submarines against both British ships, but also neutral vessels. And it's really the sinking of American ships and both kind of merchant ships, but also ocean liners like the Lusitania, and this increasingly aggressive posture that Germany is taking towards the United States that ultimately pushes Wilson to abandon neutrality and join the war. So when Wilson goes before Congress and calls for the United States to get involved in the First World War, he makes this argument that is very much connected to his progressive values. He says the world must be made safe for democracy. Its peace must be planted upon the tested foundations of political liberty. We are but one of the champions of the rights of mankind. We shall be satisfied when those rights have been made as secure as the faith and the freedom of nations can make them. So the United States really sort of wants Wilson, sort of is leading the US into the war in order to kind of, as he said, make the world safe for democracy. And he sort of, it's been argued that he really wanted to get involved eventually in the war because he felt like if he were, sort of the leader of a nation who participated in the war, he would have the ability to shape whatever peace agreement could be, reached at the end of the war. Wilson's speech mostly united even some reluctant Americans behind American entry into the war. But there was still quite a bit of opposition to America getting involved in Congress. 50 members of Congress and 6 senators voted against declaring war. So the government was very much aware that public sentiment about America getting involved in the war had been divided, and it remains so even after we actually officially become involved. Wilson believed that he was going to have to take extraordinary measures to bring the American people along with him once he decided to declare war on Germany. So there is this sort of strong anti-war opposition that is in the United States, even after the United States gets involved. And above all, Wilson worried that he needed to draft an army and that he worried this was going to be very controversial. So many in his administration believed that a crucial prerequisite for victory was to try to unite public opinion behind the war effort. He believed he had to sell the war to the public. And this explains his creation of the Committee on Public Information, which was established under the direction of a man named George Creel. They orchestrated this vast propaganda campaign designed to try to promote the war effort, to try to sell participation into the war. All kinds of posters, for example, the famous poster of Uncle Sam pointing his index finger and saying, "I want you." This comes from that period. And they distributed all kinds of this printed material. They also encouraged journalists to censor war news and to only sort of report what the government wanted. There were government distributed posters, films. As you can see, they really argue for sort of both kind of unity on the home front, but also sort of very exaggerated portrayals of the enemy. You can see here with this one, destroy this mad brute, enlist, beat back the Hun with Liberty bonds. You have these very menacing figures, and they're trying to kind of sell the public on the war. So these advertisements asked American citizens also to report to any authorities evidence of disloyalty, pessimism, even longing for peace. And the government also began efforts to suppress dissent. They passed the Espionage and Sedition Acts in 1917 and 1918. Particularly the 1918 Sabotage Act and Sedition Act made it illegal to publicly express opposition to the war. And in practice, it allowed officials to prosecute anyone who was critical of the government or the president. This is really sort of explained by this idealistic articulation of the country's war aims. We're fighting a war to end all wars. We're fighting this war to make the world safe for democracy. But it also explains Wilson's demand for legislation like this Espionage Act and the Sedition Act, which was really sort of about preventing dissent. And so Wilson really feels like he needs to stop those who would actively oppose the war. He felt like the American public might be susceptible to this, anti-war message, and they really wanted to get the public behind the war. So the most frequent targets of these acts were anti-capitalist groups like the Socialist Party, the Industrial Workers of the World, sort of socialists and radicals became sort of targets. Union activists became targets. And even, sort of immigrants became targets not only for government repression, but also vigilante violence. The government spreading this information encouraged, sort of vigilante sort of violence against anybody who challenged the war. And immigrants, particularly German Americans, really became targets for this kind of hyper patriotism that was being promoted by the American government. So there's a campaign to purge society of anything that's German. Performances of German music get banned. German books get pulled off the shelves of libraries. Courses in the German language are dropped. Germans get fired from their jobs in wartime industries. Even sort of renaming German foods. The Frankfurter becomes the hot dog. Sauerkraut becomes known as Liberty cabbage during the war. Many German American families end up changing their names at this point because they don't want to be associated. They don't want to become targets for violence. And one kind of, particularly horrific example, in 1918, a mob in East St. Louis, which had a very large German population, seized a man named Robert Prager. They stripped him, they dressed him in an American flag, they marched him through the streets, and then they lynched him. And the eventual trial of the perpetrators of this led to their acquittal on the grounds that this lynching was a quote-unquote patriotic murder. So we get this sort of hyper-patriotism developing during the war. The war ends up changing the lives of many Americans. I'm going to focus particularly on the impact that the war has on African Americans, but also women as well. 200,000 black soldiers served in World War I, including 42,000 combat troops. They were among the first sent into action in France, and they served with incredible distinction in some cases. Despite their contributions, no black soldiers were allowed to march in the victory celebrations in Paris, and they faced a lot of discrimination in the military, both, abroad and also on the home front. Those who did not go to war also found their lives changing at home. During the war, African Americans in the South, hearing about the opportunities for jobs in the North, and also wanting to get away from the violence and the repression in the South, we start to see a beginning that African Americans beginning to move north in huge numbers. So this is what's known as the Great Migration. This is this large population shift of Black people leaving the South. This begins during the war, and it really is going to continue up through the early part of the 20th century into kind of the post-World War II era. Between 1916 and 1918, more than 450,000 African Americans leave the South and come to cities like St. Louis and Chicago and Detroit and Cleveland. They found a lot more racial freedom in the North, but also different living conditions. And they also encounter increasing racial tensions and violence in the North during the war as well. In the North, there are race riots that break out in a number of cities. These are not cases of Black on Black violence. They're rather white citizens attacking Black sort of newcomers. Even Black servicemen coming home still in their uniforms became targets for violence. Black Americans are more and more inclined during this era to fight back. And the experience of serving in this war ostensibly to spread America's democratic values, made a lot of people more acutely aware of their own lack of equality at home. So we see a new kind of militant spirit arising out of the war. And we're going to see sort of how this results in real sort of cultural and social changes for Black Americans during the 1920s. The lives of many American women were also transformed by the war. Women's job opportunities increased during the war. Women are serving in industries that previously had been mostly men. They're filling this labor shortage that was left by men who had gone off to fight. The war didn't result in a huge upsurge of women working. And unlike in World War II, we see large numbers of married women during World War I are not leaving their homes to work in war industries. But we do see some new opportunities and in some cases higher pay. Women are also serving in the Army and the Navy. They're serving in the Nurse Corps, the Navy itself, the Marines and the Coast Guard. They are serving their country in the military before they were allowed to actually even vote. Women on the home front were also fighting for the right to vote while the war was going on. And they encountered a lot of criticism for doing this. But they were really determined to hold President Wilson accountable to his democratic ideals. We can see that in this picture here on the bottom right. They sort of holding up a sign in front of the White House saying, President Wilson is deceiving the world when he appears as the prophet of democracy. President Wilson has opposed those who demand democracy for this country. He is responsible for the disenfranchisement of millions of Americans. We in America know this. The world will find him out. So it was the service of women in the military and in defense industries that gave a huge push to the passage of the 19th Amendment. Wilson is influenced in part to support suffrage because of the bravery of women who were serving at the front and the women who were replacing men in offices and factories around the country. So he begins to advocate for women's suffrage during the war. Women also were very actively involved in peace movements, both during and then after the war. And we see sort of, large efforts by women, particularly women like Jane Addams, who was very active in this regard, to establish the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. Jane Addams actually travels with sort of President Wilson to the Versailles Conference, and helps him sort of craft some of the peace terms. And in 1931, she got the Nobel Peace Prize for her efforts. So now we kind of turn our attention a little bit more back to the war, and specifically the end of the war. In 1918, in January 1918, Wilson presented three sort of categories of his war aims to Congress, and this becomes known as the 14 points. They were sort of these three broad categories, and there were kind of some recommendations for adjusting the boundaries of the post-war world, national boundaries, establishing new nations to replace the dissolved empires, the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire that had, kind of collapsed during the war. This really reflected Wilson's ideals about the right of people to self-determination. So he argued that nations, sort of should be able to define their own boundaries, should be able to, sort of determine their own fate, that each nationality should have its own country. Of course, it's a lot easier to state those kinds of principles rather than to actually implement them. There were some general principles within the 14 points that were designed to kind of govern international conflict conduct in the future. Things like freedom of trade, freedom of the seas, countries making open alliances rather than making secret treaties with each other. And then Wilson proposed what he called a general association of nations to help implement these new principles. So this was what eventually becomes known as the League of Nations. So this is Wilson's 14 points really captivated a lot of people in Europe and America at the time. It reflected this sort of idealism, this belief that the world could sort of govern itself and the possibility for creating a real sort of true international peace. Remember, he's arguing this should be the war to end all wars. So he really wants to see kind of a lasting peace come out of it. So Wilson goes to Versailles to meet with the other world leaders to create a peace treaty in sort of the late 1918. And he is greeted there in Europe by sort of as kind of a savior almost. He is sort of greeted when he enters Paris in December of 1918. He's greeted, some people claim, by the largest crowd in the history of France. But he has a lot more difficulty convincing the other world leaders at the peace conference of sort of living up to these ideals that he was trying to kind of put in place. He's facing sort of the reality that all these sort of squabbling European nations are trying to kind of, advance their own national self-interest. And he is, sort of not really all that well liked by the different European leaders. They think he's too idealistic. So at the Versailles Conference, he's able to win some important victories, but he has to make some major concessions in order to realize his vision, particularly for the League of Nations. He's unable at this conference to prevent the other allies from really trying to punish Germany. And to try to make Germany particularly pay a huge amount of reparations, and to admit that they had been essentially the country that had started the war. So this is not, as Wilson had called for, a peace without victory. And of course, the sense of betrayal that the German people felt after Versailles is going to have some serious later repercussions. So Wilson is able to gain sort of endorsement and agreement to create this League of Nations, and he hopes this is an organization that's going to prevent future wars. And he brings this treaty back to America and presents it to the Senate in July of 1919. And he encounters a huge amount of opposition in the Senate for passing this treaty, mainly because opponents of the treaty were really concerned about the United States sort of pledging itself to become involved in foreign conflicts. Article 10 of the League of Nations Agreement said that all members had to respect and preserve against external aggression the territorial integrity of other members. So it's a mutual defense pact, essentially. And a lot of, senators were very opposed to this. They argued that this was going to destroy America's sovereignty. They argued that this was going to involve us in future conflicts. And you can see that opposition here in this cartoon. There is a huge amount of opposition in the Senate, and Wilson is not really, in the mood to compromise on this. He believes that he could get the country to ratify the treaty if he takes his case directly to the American people. And so he begins this cross-country speaking tour to get public support for his treaty. He's traveling for more than 3 weeks, more than 8,000 miles on the train. He's speaking as often as 4 times a day. He's not getting any rest. He gave 37 speeches in 29 cities. He's greeted very warmly by the American public, but he is not in the best of health. And after he gives a speech in Colorado, on September 25th, 1919, he collapses with severe headaches. He is immediately rushed back to Washington, and a few days later, he suffers a massive stroke, which leaves his left side totally paralyzed. His vision is impaired, and for the next year and a half, basically, he is incapable of running the government. His wife, Edith Wilson, and his doctors ended up kind of essentially running the White House, and they prevented the public from receiving much information about how severe his condition really was. This is before, of course, the rise of mass media, and it was a time when something like this could be effectively kept secret. So he's unable to lead the fight for the League of Nations, and eventually the treaty gets killed by the Senate in March of 1920. By now, the public is, sort of not all that interested in. They really want to move on from the war. And of course, there had been a, influenza pandemic as well. So the public is suffering from a lot of disillusionment, this pandemic, and then also sort of social unrest that comes out of the war. And to the post-war generation, World War I really seemed to be very futile and wasteful. The progressive spirit, which had, at least in part, led the United States to become involved in the war, it survives, but it doesn't have the same kind of enthusiasm or broad-based support that it had enjoyed before the war. And Americans, above all, are just trying to get their lives back to normal, and they really welcome their new president's call for a return to normalcy. So there is a lot of disillusionment that comes out of the war. All right, so we're going to see how that sort of leads us into the 1920s next week. But before coming to class on October 9th, make sure that you've read chapters 20 and 21 in your textbook and that you've completed the reading quizzes. And I also want you to read chapter 5 in your Going to the Source text. This is a chapter which is looking at advertisements in the African American press. And so it's from this era of the progressive era, and it's really looking at sort of what these advertisements can tell us about the African American community during this period and the kind of debates that are going on within the community. So that's what we're going to be doing this week, and I will see everybody in class.